On August 12, 1952, 13 Jewish intellectuals were led one by one into the basement of Moscow's Lubyanka prison and shot. Not a single Soviet newspaper printed a word about it. Their families were told nothing. For 3 years, wives and children sent letters to prison addresses that no longer existed, begging for information about people who were already dead. The Soviet state had perfected many instruments of terror, but in this case, it deployed its most suffocating weapon: silence. What Stalin did not anticipate was that the people he tried to erase had already turned that same weapon against him. To understand how 13 people ended up in that basement, you have to go back 10 years to a moment when Stalin actually needed Jews. In the spring of 1942, the Soviet Union was hemorrhaging. The Wehrmacht had pushed deep into Soviet territory. Millions of soldiers were dead or captured, and Stalin was desperate for international support, particularly from the United States and Britain. He understood something with the cold pragmatism that defined his rule. Jews had influence in the West. Jewish communities in New York, London, and Buenos Aires could be mobilized to pressure their governments into sending more aid, opening a second front, and sustaining the alliance against Hitler. So in April 1942, on Stalin's direct orders, the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee was established in Kuibyshev. Its chairman was Solomon Mikuls, born Shimeliovich in 1890 in Dvinsk, in what is now Latvia. Mikuls was the artistic director of the Moscow State Jewish Theatre, and arguably the most recognized Jewish cultural figure in the Soviet Union. He had played Tevye, the role that would later become famous through Fiddler on the Roof, and he had directed a legendary Yiddish production of King Lear in 1935. But Mikuls was more than an actor. Historian Jeffrey Weidlinger has argued that his theatrical productions contained veiled critiques of Stalin's regime and quiet assertions of Jewish national identity, hidden beneath the surface of ostensibly loyal Soviet art. Mikuls assembled around him the most prominent Jewish intellectuals the Soviet Union had. Peretz Markish, born in 1895 in Polno, Volhynia, a poet who had received the Order of Lenin in 1939. David Bergelson, a novelist of quiet, lyrical precision. Itzik Pfeffer, both a poet and a wartime resistance figure. David Hofstein, who had published a collection of poems illustrated by Marc Chagall. Leib Kvitko, a beloved children's author. Benjamin Zuskin, Mikuls's protégé and successor at the Jewish Theatre. Solomon Lozovsky, born in 1878 in the Yekaterinoslav Governorate, a veteran Bolshevik who had joined the party in 1901 and served as Deputy People's Commissar for Foreign Affairs. And Boris Shimeliovich, born in Riga in 1892, the medical director of Moscow's Botkin Hospital, one of the most respected medical institutions in the country. In 1943, Mikuls and Pfeffer traveled to the United States and England on a 7-month tour to raise support. They met with Albert Einstein. They spoke at massive rallies in New York. They appeared alongside Paul Robeson. They raised millions. The mission was a spectacular success by every metric the Kremlin cared about. But something happened during that tour that Stalin did not control. These Jewish intellectuals tasted connection. They met Jewish communities that were thriving, that had institutions, schools, theaters, newspapers in Yiddish. They saw what Jewish life could look like without the crushing weight of ideological conformity. And when they returned, they carried that vision with them. After the war, the committee's mission shifted. The members of the JAC had spent years collecting testimony about the Nazi genocide of Soviet Jews. They had compiled material for a project called The Black Book, documenting atrocities committed against Jews in Nazi-occupied Soviet territory. But beyond documentation, they now advocated for something the Kremlin found far more threatening: the reconstruction of Jewish communal life. They proposed agricultural resettlement for Holocaust survivors in Crimea. They pushed for the continuation of Yiddish publishing, theater, and education. In a state that demanded total ideological uniformity, they were asserting the right to be specifically, visibly, unapologetically Jewish. Then came 1948. Two events in rapid succession sealed the committee's fate. The first was the establishment of the State of Israel on May 14th. Stalin had initially supported its creation, calculating that a socialist-leaning state in the Middle East would serve Soviet strategic interests. He was the second world leader to recognize the new nation. But what he had not anticipated was the reaction of Soviet Jews. For millions of Jews inside the Soviet Union, the creation of Israel ignited something that decades of suppression had failed to extinguish. The second event made that ignition visible. In September 1948, Golda Meir arrived in Moscow as Israel's first ambassador to the Soviet Union. She carried the first Israeli-issued passport. On October 3rd, the first day of Rosh Hashanah, she went to the Moscow Choral Synagogue. On a typical holiday, the synagogue drew around 2,000 worshippers. That day, according to multiple eyewitness accounts documented by the Museum of the Jewish People, approximately 50,000 Jews filled the streets. Red Army officers in uniform, elderly survivors, teenagers, parents carrying infants. They had come with no organization, no flyers, no coordination. Word had simply passed from mouth to mouth, from kitchen to kitchen, from whisper to whisper. Meir described the moment in her autobiography, My Life. As she approached, the crowd surged toward her, calling her name. They chanted in Russian, Nasha Golda, our Golda. They shouted words that would echo for decades. We are alive. We are alive. Overwhelmed, Meir could only respond with a single sentence that would become iconic. Thank you for remaining Jewish. No one gave a speech. No one raised a banner. No one shouted political slogans. 50,000 people simply showed up in a totalitarian state where showing up was the most dangerous thing you could do. They fought with presence. They resisted with visibility. Their weapon was silence. Stalin received detailed reports about the gathering within hours. According to accounts compiled by the Museum of the Jewish People, the significance was not lost on him. These were not dissidents. These were not foreign agents. These were ordinary Soviet citizens whose deepest loyalty, it was now clear, did not belong to the party. The mask had slipped, not through sabotage or conspiracy, but through the simple act of walking to a synagogue on a holiday morning. The retaliation was swift, methodical, and wrapped in the language of state security. On January 13, 1948, just weeks before the Rosh Hashanah gathering could take place, Stalin had already struck the first blow. Solomon Mikuls was in Minsk on an official assignment for the State Committee for Theater Prizes. He was invited to dinner at the home of a friend. A car was sent to pick him up. But the car did not go to dinner. Mikuls was taken to a dacha belonging to the Ministry of State Security. There, under the supervision of Deputy Minister Sergei Ogoltsov, he was murdered. His body, and that of a colleague, the theater critic Vladimir Golubov-Potapov, were dumped on a roadside and run over by a truck to simulate a traffic accident. The staging was crude, and many suspected the truth immediately. Peretz Markish, the poet, wrote a verse suggesting that Mikul's name should be added to the 6 million victims of the Holocaust. Stalin's own daughter, Svetlana Alliluyeva, later wrote in her memoir that she had overheard her father on the telephone. Something was being reported to him, and he responded with a suggestion, not a question. She recalled his words precisely. He was not asking what had happened. He was telling someone what the story would be. A state funeral followed. Thousands of Jews attended. The theater was renamed in Mikul's honor. 2 weeks later, Mikul's assassin, Lavrenti Tsanova, received the Order of Lenin for what was officially described as the exemplary execution of a special government assignment. With Mikul's dead, the dismantling of the JAC accelerated. Arrests began in September 1948 and continued through June 1949. 15 members were taken into custody on fabricated charges of espionage, treason, and bourgeois nationalism. The evidence against them was absurd. Their primary crime was having communicated with Jewish organizations in other countries, which was the entire purpose of the committee that Stalin himself had created. A letter the JAC leadership had written proposing Jewish settlement in Crimea was reframed as proof of a secessionist conspiracy. What followed was 3 years of interrogation designed to break every defendant into confession. According to the trial transcript published in 1994 and analyzed by scholars, including Joshua Rubenstein and Vladimir Naumov in their volume Stalin's Secret Pogrom, the methods were systematic. Interrogations lasted days without rest. Food and medical care were withheld. Beatings were constant. The goal was not information. The goal was words. Specifically, the words, "I confess." In the Soviet system, a confession was the cornerstone of a conviction. Without it, even a show trial lost its theatrical coherence. Most of the defendants eventually broke. The pressure was designed to be unsurvivable. Joseph Yusefovich, a researcher at the Institute of History, told the court what that breaking point felt like. He said he had been ready to confess that he was the Pope's own nephew, acting on the pontiff's personal orders, simply to make the beating stop. He used absurdity to describe a process that had obliterated his will. But not everyone broke. And here, the silence becomes something else entirely. Boris Shimeliovich, the medical director of Botkin Hospital, was arrested on January 13, 1949, exactly 1 year after Mikul's was killed. He was an active revolutionary who had served in the Russian Civil War. He was a committed Soviet citizen, and he refused, absolutely and without qualification, to confess to crimes he had not committed. During his interrogation, as documented in the trial transcript and reported by the World Jewish Congress, Shimeliovich counted the blows. He reached over 2,000 strikes to his buttocks and heels before he stopped counting. He was beaten so severely that 3 years later, when the trial finally began, he had to be carried into the courtroom on a stretcher. He never confessed. Not once. Not to espionage, not to treason, not to nationalism, not to any of the charges fabricated against him. In a system designed to manufacture guilt through pain, Shimeliovich's silence was an act of defiance that the regime could not process. He gave them nothing. His body absorbed every blow, and his mouth remained shut. According to the academic analysis by Alice Nakimovsky published in East European Jewish Affairs, Shimeliovich's resistance during the trial was unlike anything seen in the Soviet show trials of the 1930s. In those earlier spectacles, defendants had typically cooperated, delivering scripted confessions as part of a grim theatrical performance. Shimeliovich refused the script entirely. Solomon Lozovsky mounted a different kind of resistance. At 70 years old when arrested, he was the last surviving old Bolshevik, a man who had been part of the revolution itself. He had been expelled from the party twice and readmitted twice. He had organized railway workers, spent years in exile, lived in France, run the Red International Labor Union. His revolutionary credentials were older than Stalin's regime, and according to multiple sources, including his Goodreads biography and the trial record analyzed by Rubenstein and Naumov, despite incredible pressure, Lozovsky never admitted his guilt and never accused another person. When he faced his judges, he delivered a statement that the Times of Israel would later quote, "My conscience is clear before the court, before the people, and before my party. I shall not ask for mercy." He did not beg. He did not bargain. He simply stated, with the calm of a man who had survived the Tsar's prisons and the Civil War and the purges, that he was innocent. In a courtroom with no prosecutors and no defense attorneys, only 3 military judges whose verdict was predetermined, Lozovsky used his final moments of speech to assert a truth that the system was designed to make impossible. The trial began on May 8, 1952, and lasted until sentencing on July 18th. The structure was peculiar even by Soviet standards. There were no prosecutors, there were no defense lawyers, just 3 military judges of the Supreme Court. Joshua Rubenstein has described the arrangement as nothing less than terror masquerading as law. Most defendants who had confessed under interrogation retracted their confessions in the courtroom, a departure from the compliant behavior seen in Stalin's earlier show trials. They had been broken in the basement, but in the courtroom something shifted. Facing death, they spoke. According to Naumovsky's analysis, the trial became an occasion of moral drama. Many defendants delivered speeches that could not serve as any imaginable legal defense, but constituted what she calls a moral evaluation of their lives. They were not trying to be acquitted. They knew the outcome. They were trying to say who they were before the state erased them. 3 figures stood out in their persistence. Lena Stern, the first woman elected to the Soviet Academy of Sciences, who was determined to be no less guilty than the others, but was spared execution because of her scientific value to the state. Boris Shimeliovich, silent and unbroken on his stretcher, and Solomon Lozovsky, standing at 74, declaring his conscience clear. The sentence was issued on July 18, 1952. The court decreed the severest measure of punishment, execution, with confiscation of all property. The defendants were stripped of their medals. Petitions were filed to revoke their civilian commendations, including the Order of Lenin and the Order of the Red Banner of Labor. 1 month on death row followed. Then, on the night of August 12, 1952, 13 of the 15 defendants were taken to the basement of Lubyanka prison and executed by firing squad. The 13th was Amelia Tuman, born in Bern, Switzerland, in 1905, a deputy editor of the Diplomatic Dictionary. The 14th defendant, Solomon Bregman, a former deputy commissar of foreign affairs, had denounced the trial during the proceedings and collapsed into a coma. He was transferred unconscious to the medical unit of Butyrka prison, where he died on January 23, 1953. The 15th, Lena Stern, received 3.5 years in a labor camp, followed by 5 years of exile. She survived. And then came the most devastating silence of all, the silence of erasure. After the executions, not a single reference to the trial or its outcome appeared in any Soviet newspaper. The event simply did not exist in the official record. The families of the executed were charged with a crime that sounds invented, but was codified in Soviet law, being relatives of traitors to the motherland. In December 1952, they were exiled. They did not know whether their husbands, fathers, mothers were alive, dead, imprisoned, or deported. They wrote letters. They made inquiries. They were met with bureaucratic silence. They would not learn the truth until November 1955, more than 3 years after the executions and more than 2 years after Stalin's own death. When the case was finally reopened, the military collegium of the Supreme Court withdrew all indictments, stating there had been no evidence to support them. Every charge had been fabricated. Every confession had been extracted through torture. The entire case was, in legal language, baseless. But even then, the silence continued in a different form. When Nikita Khrushchev delivered his famous secret speech at the 20th Party Congress in February 1956, cataloguing Stalin's crimes in devastating detail, he passed over Stalin's persecution of Jews, as the journal Foreign Affairs noted, in utter silence. The anti-cosmopolitan campaign, the destruction of the JAC, the night of the murdered poets, the doctor's plot, none of it was mentioned. The crimes existed, but the victims remained invisible. Their Jewishness, which was the very reason they had been targeted, was too inconvenient to acknowledge. The doctor's plot, which began in January 1953, followed the same architecture of silence and fabrication. 9 eminent physicians, 6 of them Jewish, were accused of conspiring to assassinate top Soviet leaders through deliberate medical malpractice. Among the accused was Miron Vovsi, Stalin's own personal physician, who happened to be Solomon Mikol's cousin. The circle of persecution was closing on itself. Pravda announced the arrests under a headline that translated to vicious spies and killers under the mask of academic physicians. Confessions were extracted through torture. The case was explicitly linked to the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee and to an organization called the Joint, the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, which was described as a Zionist espionage front. Initially, 37 people were arrested. The number quickly grew into hundreds. Across the Soviet Union, Jewish doctors were fired, arrested, sent to gulags. Ukraine discovered a local version of the plot supposedly headed by Viktor Kogan-Yasny, the endocrinologist who had been the first in the USSR to treat diabetes with insulin, saving thousands of lives. 36 additional plotters were arrested there. Albert Einstein and Winston Churchill sent telegrams to the Soviet Foreign Ministry demanding an investigation. A bomb exploded in the courtyard of the Soviet embassy in Tel Aviv on February 9, 1953, wounding 4 staff members. The Soviet Union broke diplomatic relations with Israel, according to several historians, including those cited in the journal article published by the National Institutes of Health on the 50th anniversary of the case. Stalin intended the doctor's plot as a prelude to something far larger. The mass deportation of Soviet Jews to labor camps in Siberia and Central Asia, transported in cattle cars. The Soviet Union's approximately 2 million Jews, nearly all of them Holocaust survivors, would have been subjected to what some scholars have described as a potential Soviet genocide. It did not happen. On March 5, 1953, Joseph Stalin died. Whether from a cerebral hemorrhage or, as some historians have speculated based on suspicious inconsistencies in official accounts, from poisoning by those around him who feared the escalation, his death halted the machinery. On April 3, 1953, Pravda announced that the doctors were innocent. Their confessions had been obtained through impermissible means of investigation. The survivors were released. But the dead stayed dead. Mikul stayed dead in his staged car accident. The 13 in the Lubyanka basement stayed dead. The writers, the poets, the actor, the doctor who counted his blows, the old Bolshevik who would not bend. They were gone. Their manuscripts were locked away. Yiddish publishing houses were shuttered. The Moscow State Jewish Theater was closed. Periodicals were shut down. The infrastructure of an entire culture had been dismantled in 4 years. And yet, something survived. Something always survived. The Yiddish Book Center, based in Amherst, Massachusetts, maintains teaching resource kits about the night of the murdered poets. The Congress for Jewish Culture in New York holds annual memorial evenings every August 12th. The photographs from the 1946 JAC meetings, originally taken for propaganda, survive in the Central Archive of the Federal Security Service in Moscow. The Blinken Open Society Archives in Budapest holds recordings of Radio Liberty broadcasts that commemorated the murdered poets throughout the Cold War, beginning in the 1960s. A memorial for the JAC victims was dedicated in Jerusalem's Rasko neighborhood in 1977 on the 25th anniversary. Shimeliovich Communist Party membership was restored only in 1988, 36 years after his execution. The full stenographic report of the trial was published in Russian in 1994, and Rubenstein and Naumov's English translation appeared through Yale University Press in 2001. And in 1984, the State of Israel issued a 10,000 shekel banknote. On one side was a portrait of Golda Meir. On the other was the photograph taken by 18-year-old David Havkin, who had climbed onto a rooftop to capture the crowd of 50,000 Jews outside the Moscow Choral Synagogue on Rosh Hashanah 1948. Beside the image were printed the words, in Hebrew, "Let my people go." The silence of 50,000 people standing in a Moscow street, the silence of a doctor who counted 2,000 blows and said nothing. The silence of a 74-year-old revolutionary who declared his conscience clear and asked for no mercy. The silence of a state that tried to erase an execution from history, and the silence of a successor who catalogued every crime except the ones committed against Jews. These silences do not cancel each other. They accumulate. They build a record that no redaction can reach. Peretz Markish, the poet who received the Order of Lenin in 1939 and a bullet in the Lubyanka basement in 1952, once suggested in verse that Mikul's name belonged alongside the 6 million. He was right about more than he knew, not because the scale was comparable, but because the mechanism was the same. The belief that identity can be erased by killing the people who carry it. Stalin tried to delete an entire culture in 4 years. He had the secret police, the military courts, the torture chambers, the controlled press, and the absolute power of a totalitarian state. The people he killed had words, songs, poems, medical degrees, revolutionary credentials, and an ancient stubbornness that no ideology had ever managed to fully suppress. On August 12, 1952, 13 of them were silenced forever, and every year since, on that same date, in cities across the world, their words are read aloud again. 50,000 people showed up at a synagogue in Moscow in 1948 and said nothing. 77 years later, that silence is still the loudest thing Stalin ever failed to suppress.